Hello, my name is Carrie Lane, and I'm the Executive Director of PRINDIE, the Princeton Independent Film Festival. I'm here with you today for our Q&A with Boise State directors Amanda McBain and Jesse Moss, whose previous works together include The Overnighters and the Netflix series The Family, as well as documentary participant Stephen Garza, hosted by Lauren Wright. Lauren holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University and is an associate research scholar and lecturer in politics and public affairs at Princeton University. She has authored 2 books and is a frequent guest political analyst and has appeared on many of the major networks, including Newsmax, where she is a regular contributor. Her research and commentary have been featured in many major publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today. She's a board member of the White House Transition Project and previously served as field representative for Meg Whitman's campaign for governor of California. Lauren, I'll turn it over to you now to begin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire. Well, thank you, Claire, for inviting me to do this. I'm a huge fan of the film, and thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Stephen. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And I actually just wanted to start out with the George Washington quote that we all saw at the very beginning of the film. It's a great one. I'll just read it really quickly so everyone remembers. Parties are likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. So first to Amanda and Jesse, what does that mean to you in the context of the film? And then I guess to all of you, is this more of a film about political parties seeking power, or is it also about politically ambitious individuals? How should we see that?
Well, hi, Lauren. Thanks for having us and for moderating this conversation to Princeton and Claire, too. So I think what motivated that is a couple of things. One is, on one hand, we're making a film about a youth government program in Texas with a bunch of teenage boys. Like, what relevance could it have to our national conversation about polarization, about democracy? But I think we wanted to signal to the audience that we feel that there is an important reflection that people should bring to the story that we're telling about Boise State. And the Washington quote, I think, does immediately provide that kind of framework. I think the scene that follows, which is that classroom scene where they're talking about Huxley and Orwell, does the same thing too. And that's before we kind of get going with the story. I think we want our audience to be sort of thinking about what Washington's quote means. I don't think there's a single takeaway. And I think that the question of the vulnerability of the party structure, as Washington suggests, is very much, I think, a question posed by Ben Feinstein's actions in the film, and the degree to which we see that embodied in Washington today is really something for the audience to unpack. So I think it's also, there's a related and very interesting question about whether the program in staging a 2-party simulation is doing our democracy a service or disservice. I mean, you could argue both ways. And I'd love to hear both your perspective on that and Stephen's, actually. So I think they have to sort of set a certain number of rules for the program, and that's one of them. Otherwise, it would be total chaos. It's already a lot of chaos. And I think it's in some ways a smart choice, but it does make the program and the party system vulnerable in the same way we see it nationally.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, do you want to jump in on that? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I think it's a bit of everything. I think overall, just what the American system of government is on a local, state, and national level. And I mean, there's so many. I think there's a lot of commentary in the film without there being any commentary from the filmmakers at all. They really do allow for the program and the participants in the program to speak for themselves and for the audience to judge what exactly is the takeaway from all this. So I think that it is a film about political parties, about the political process, where the country's heading, what the leaders of tomorrow are doing today, what is on the generation's mind, and what it's like to grow up in this, post-Trump world in the United States.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to save this question a little bit for later, but it struck me that The boys that you chose to follow, Jesse and Amanda, made it so far in this process, and it made me think, thinking about the relationship between charismatic individuals and political parties. Do the same people who make for really compelling documentary film, I guess characters or participants also make for really compelling, very talented politicians? And I think Stephen's a great example of that. He was really beloved by all of his colleagues on campus.
I think that's a great question. And there's a lot of ways to answer that. I will say that in Stephen's case, what's so interesting, we spent a lot of time, by the way, finding the folks that we were going to actually follow through this program, knowing we had to shoot it in 1 week.
Mm-hmm.
We really wanted to be secure with a group of very different individuals with different politics and different backgrounds before the event got started. Otherwise, we didn't get the film in 1 week, we didn't get it. But so in that 3-month period where we were sifting through 1,100 people headed to Texas Boys State and trying to find our group that we were going to follow, Jesse did run into Stephen at an orientation for 300 some odd kids, all of whom were very loud and very charismatic and very boisterous, and different degrees of sort of fabulousness in ways that could have been cast. But for whatever reason, Jesse really zoned in on Stephen, who was actually quieter in that group, who had a different sort of kind of an unexpected charisma, really, this kind of old soul quality. And that gravitational pull, whatever it was, partly coming from Stephen for sure, but also Jesse's recognition that there was something to Stephen. We didn't know whether he could give a speech in front of 600 or 1,000 people. I'm not even sure Stephen knew that, but we knew there was something to this person that meant something to Jesse, that meant something for our film. And we knew we needed liberal politics, but we also needed something else. And Stephen had that something else. And that is a little bit irrational, frankly, whatever that is. I don't know how to explain it. But the other piece of that question is really charisma in terms of does the camera affect how you are in front of the camera, right? And all of the people we ended up following, I think, had a naturalism to them that felt authentic to who they were. And it wasn't so much of a performance. Any political act, or any act really, frankly, in front of a documentary will be partly, some teeny part will be a performance, because it is, you have a camera in your face, but actually,
and often an audience and
an audience and what all these things, right? But to the degree that they were natural and not mugging for us, we found those people. And I think that's a little bit of what the audience responded to, particularly with Stephen too, is authenticity and integrity.
And I think it's a good fortune that Stephen and Robert are pitted against each other, because they have very different personalities. In some ways, Robert is a more traditional embodiment of a kind of classic politician. I think when we think of a certain kind of old-fashioned politician, right, a kind of George W. Bush.
Someone you want to have a beer with,
yeah,
if they were old enough.
And I think Robert campaigns on his personality, and Stephen also, but a very different kind of presentation of self. And that's not to say I think we witness, as we know, there's not one right model, but it does require a certain level of comfort in presenting yourself, because that's what you're asking people to do. You're asking to represent people, and how do you sort of embody that?
Yeah, Stephen, did you get used to cameras following you around by the end of the week?
Oh yeah, it's we did some brief filming prior to the actual program itself. Filming the interview where I'm on those steps near my grandmother's apartments, and while I'm block walking for a congressional candidate and saying hi to that squirrel. By the first day, by the time the first day was over, it was pretty. You're so focused on what's going on around you, and I'm over here struggling to get on the ballot, stressing about writing speeches and trying to win over votes and support, that the camera really does become secondary. And so most of the kids in the program, it does kind of fade into the background. You're not focused on who's filmed, because even though all of us have a camera crew on us, they're also, if my camera person on me sees something going on, maybe on the other side of the room that he wants to capture, he'll leave and go do that,
Mm-hmm.
from all these other boys. So it didn't really make us special. It didn't make us that special. It would turn heads maybe once, but after that, you were kind of over it. I mean, what's the difference between somebody filming with a professional camera like the filmmakers and somebody filming something on their phone at the program?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I've heard it described and throughout the film, it's high energy, it's chaotic. You mentioned you're trying to get all these signatures and it's sort of frantic, but to me, you seemed like a very calm person in the storm of stressful, very fast-paced events. And I loved it, sort of a joke you made at the beginning about it should be people's state, not boy state and girl state. And it made me really think, how would the process have been different, do you think? Maybe first to you, Stephen, and then to the directors, if there was gender representation and more racial representation. As Renee says, I've never seen so many white people before.
I've been thinking about this very recently too. Of the people's takeaway from the film might be, depending on who they were supporting and what the ultimate results were, less hopeful and optimistic about the future. But you got to take a step back and look at the simulation itself, and then it's not perfect and it's not representative of Texas or the country for that matter. It was overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly conservative. And even with those odds stacked against us, two people in the racial and political minority, Renee and myself, still rose all the way up to, Renee to the state party chairmanship, one of two people out of 1,000, and myself being one of two people out of 1,000 that you could pick for the top position. Now imagine you throw in people who look like me and are more reflective of the demographics of our state and country, and you throw in, women and non-binary people and everybody, that makes up this country. If we're able to do so well in that very conservative white environment, I imagine what not only myself or Renee, but anybody else like us could do in the simulation of everyone all together in this people state. And so I hope, soon, in the next few years, hopefully the attention that the film is getting, and with Jesse and Amanda wanting to pursue a sister sibling to the film in Girls State or Girls Nation, that they'll have the chance to document a first ever people state in a couple of years. That'll be very, very amazing.
I think we share Stephen's sentiment that we'd like there to be a people state. One thing you see is that it is an old-fashioned program. It's a product of the American Legion. It's sponsored by the organization. It has been around for about 80 years. And with the pageantry, some of the patriotism, it does feel a little bit old-fashioned, like it's got a foot squarely in the 1950s, and it also has a foot in the 21st century. And I think that straddle is a little bit uneasy, but it's also the straddle of our country in some ways. And the organization, I think, understands that they have a lot of work to do to represent what Texas looks like today, politically and racially. And Stephen and Renee really are in the minority, both as African-American and Hispanic, but also politically. But I think that also for us makes the story more dramatic, and I think representative of the political struggle that we see today and have seen for a long time, of voices that have been underrepresented in our democracy really having to struggle to be heard. And I think the great surprise of the film is not only that they find their voice, but that they find support within this overwhelmingly white and conservative group. So that was actually, for us as storytellers, really exciting to see. But for a program that should embody and hopefully kind of nurture our democracy, it perhaps needs to be more representative. And I think, I don't know what your perspective is, Amanda, and we've talked about it, but sort of how abortion is, addressed by an all-male group is was pretty interesting to observe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that was the one moment. I think I probably should have recognized before going into this shoot, what I did recognize once I got there, which is that we had this, we went with all these questions about democracy and polarization. And then when I got there, I saw, wow, what a window into boyhood. Because I've never been in a room like this, 1,100 17-year-old males. And what an interesting time to check in on that group, because this was 2018, right? So Me Too movement was in conversations around toxic masculinity. This was a really interesting time to sort of check in on boyhood. And I think that I had a certain amount of preconceived notions about that perhaps were failings of my own imagination. I expected to see Lord of the Flies. I expected to see, ridiculous conversations about abortion. I expected to see certain things. What I didn't expect, again, since we're talking about surprises, is this sort of extraordinary display of like a range of masculinity and a range of sort of understandings of power and understandings of strength. And so, you see empathic leadership and you see that have effect and power. And you also see sort of playing to the cheap seats and, boys will be boys kind of behavior. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really interesting to watch, that both had power and encouraging, frankly, that is also, that can work. and I always like to be surprised, frankly, as documentary filmmakers. That's why we do what we do, because I don't want to be right about everything, and I want to learn something. But yeah, the abortion thing, I'm more interested. I would like to hear the girl state version of that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'm going to put my political scientist hat on a little bit. And I think you're studying political science at UT. Is that right, Stephen? So yeah, you've probably heard some version of this debate, but there's an active conversation happening about how much we should make American politics look like entertainment, because one of the huge problems we have is engagement of young people. Less than half of 18 to 29-year-olds voted in 2016, and that was an improvement from 2012. And so I think we see that if politics starts to look like entertainment, more people might be engaged, and that's certainly one goal. But you lose some of the policy and the nuance, and then you do have candidates jumping into the political process that either might be self-interested, or they're power seeking, or they're not qualified to govern. And that's something that comes up a lot in the Federalist papers, which is something I'm teaching right now to my students. So I guess, knowing that, I wasn't that surprised at the shock and awe tactics of sort of the Federalists' general election, and even Robert's primary. But you, Stephen, seem to really have a knack for bridging divides and finding common ground. And that's not always the easiest tactic. I guess, so Stephen, why do you think you're good at that? Where does that come from?
I like history, and I sound like Ben saying this. I like history because it offers you an opportunity to learn from the mistakes of the past, and that I find essentially everything so abhorrent of the current president, and it's I try not to get too political, even though this is a political film, and we dive into that. But I mean, at the end of the day, I got to, sit down and we have to grasp with the fact that, what was the final? It was 60 to 63 million or something like that. So even though Hillary Clinton did win by 3 million more votes, almost half the country, voted for Donald Trump. And you can't just ignore that other half, as much as it boggles my mind why, there's reasons why people voted for that, for him over Clinton, or voted third party. And so that has been, as we all kind of struggle to realize, like trying to pick up the pieces of what's been happening the past 4 years, is as myself, I have very strong political opinions that will never, ever be put on a bargaining table, or used, or given away for something else. There are positions that I have that I will, stand on and die on that hill, and never, ever in a million years give up. But I also believe that just because I have those opinions doesn't mean that I can't come to the table with other people who don't agree with me necessarily, but kind of want to see the same things done. And with guns being a big part of the story of the later half of the film, with 90% of Americans supporting universal background checks, that seems like something that Congress could easily get accomplished in just one neat, clean bill, get it through both houses and send it on its way to the president's desk. But because both sides are so unwilling to talk to each other and they're trying to one up each other and add all this pork to a bill, it'll die in committee and that'll be the end of that and nothing ever gets done. So I think that it's a tire show. I think the whole common ground thing. Should you, as a Democrat, should you appeal to the more moderate conservative voters? Do you appeal to the more left people in your party? As a Republican, do you appeal to the libertarians or do you appeal to the far right? For me, what politics is that one scene in the film where they passed that bipartisan bill, and it was so amazing. Sorry, there's thunder and it's raining right now. You would never, I don't think in a long time see that where two people literally reach across the aisle to shake hands with each other and celebrate passing something and actually getting to go home and saying, man, we did something good for the American people today. For all the faults and issues that we are going to be divided on for the rest of time and all these arguments that we're going to have in the future, damn it, does it feel good to know, that we accomplished something that made, the general Americans. So I think my desire to see more of that and my desire to be empathetic and to hear people who I don't agree with and who will, a lot of people at Boise State said the most awful things I ever heard in my entire life. But I sat down and I said, I want to know what's on your mind so that I can walk away here better, having a greater knowledge of what it's like, maybe not growing up as someone like me living in a city. What issues are affecting you living in a small town of 1,000 people? What issues are affecting you, even though you have a certain amount of privilege based on who your parents are or where you grew up and those sort of things. So I guess that's where my desire to hear everybody and then to take all those opinions in consideration without compromising the values that I hold dear to me and trying to come up with a product that will leave, everybody somewhat, okay, that's fair at the end of the day. So I'm not sure if that answered the question.
I mean, a lot of politicians could learn a lot from you, that's for sure. Jesse and Amanda, do you have any thoughts on either sort of this practical versus ideological question or the relationship between entertainment and politics and the line that's getting blurred, it seems, in the last few years?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we talked about how the program is a little bit old-fashioned, but one of the things that's so evidently unique about it and rare in American life is it actually brings people together face-to-face who have different politics. And those spaces we know are harder to find. We're so siloed in our our family life, our social media, that our exposure to those ideas is just harder to come by, and to people who hold those beliefs, who can actually have a conversation with. So we were really drawn to a space that provides for that conversation, and that Stephen is someone who was willing to try to have those conversations, because not everybody there was. I think you see spectacle at Boise State for sure, and sort of that aspect of politics. And one thing that we've talked about over the years, Amanda knows this, like I was never a fan of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, because I felt like in a way it was a critical point on the continuum that got us to Donald Trump, in that it became a substitute for political engagement. And we all like to laugh at what's happening in Washington, and there was substance to the conversation, but I always felt like it became a substitute for engagement, and I think it also contributed to the sense of politics as spectacle. And I think Trump is the sort of logical endpoint of that trajectory, and where it's all spectacle and nothing else. And I don't know how you reverse that course. It's sort of like the genie's out of the bottle, and you get to a post-fact world in which conspiracy theory is on sort of an equal footing with, fact. And I don't know that, Boys State and Girls State are going to help us kind of correct our course. And so maybe, in your study, you can help us understand the way forward. And I think that it is inescapably an aspect of politics. I mean, going back, we were talking about politicians in the 19th century and sort of who couldn't rely on, I mean, they relied on mass media to communicate themselves, their personal narratives and their political positions, but not television as a form. So we may not get back to that, a sort of Lincoln-like, person who wasn't a natural on television.
Right. What do you think, Amanda? Can we get back there?
I mean, modern era. One of the other facts of this program that was immediately recognizable and attractive was day one, it was very analog, right? And so you watch Stephen do retail politicking, you watch guys get on an actual stage, and it's a smallish, I mean, for let's say a presidential campaign, smallish group of people they're speaking one-on-one to, right? And then towards the end of this simulation, you really see the memes enter that space, right? And those are definitely all about entertainment. And you really do reduce people down to sort of the funny bits, but also the darker bits of entertainment, right? So that's racism very much enters that space, and that's highly problematic. And at least in this simulation, that's a moment where the counselors actually engaged with the statesmen, where they had been very hands-off since day one. They actually came in on that day 5 and put them all in a room, and they said, this cannot happen. That obviously doesn't happen in the adult state. There's no counselors to come in and say, this is not okay, this is not okay. So that's sort of what's entertaining, appealing to sort of the most base kind of darker aspects of what's that car crash, right? And everything else. That is not being kind of swatted down anywhere. And that's not all politicians doing it. That's the media too.
It's algorithmically driven too, and no longer the sort of boundaries of like conventional, traditional news media to sort of regulate the forms of content that, for better or for worse, you can argue with, whether the media was biased and that sort of thing. But the fact that political content is both subject to profound manipulation. Here's a very interesting fact, actually, which is that in Texas, in 2016, before the election, part of the Russian disinformation campaign was to foment the Texas secession movement, and this is actually widely reported fact that they were sort of Russian troll farms, sort of putting forward Texas secession Facebook groups as fronts. The boys in Texas in 2017 voted to secede from the Union, and that's why we were motivated to make the film. You could actually see the boys' vote as being, I think, in part triggered by that Texas secession movement, which wasn't entirely created by the Russians, but was certainly, stirred up. And so I think, like, in a strange way, this film is like an outgrowth of that vote, which is a response to that campaign. And it's just sort of ties back to this whole question of, like, the place we've found ourselves in modern politics, and how vulnerable the democracy is to manipulation, I guess, and spectacle.
I guess I'll say the one more thing, though, anecdotally, if you are asking us, in this space, in this Texas Boys State 2018 session, there was still not 100% voter turnout, which I think is really interesting, just behaviorally. Like, this is a simulation that does almost encourage tribalism, because it has these two parties, and it's very much us versus them dynamic. And so it is extremely entertaining. I mean, we got invested within 5 hours in sort of who was going to win this governor election, even though it doesn't actually have any consequences. But even still, as invested as we all were, I don't remember, maybe Stephen remembers, but it was not 100% voter turnout. And that's all these kids had to do that week. They didn't have other jobs that prevented them from going to the polls. There was no there was nothing preventing them from voting, and yet they didn't vote. So I don't know, even in the most kind of heightened entertaining circumstances, with all the memes, with the tribalism, with everything else, still people have other things they want to do, and I don't know what that's about. So I have a lot of hopes in seeing bridge makers like Stephen, or sort of just powerful people like Renee, or frankly, brilliant people like Ben, um, who just have that commitment to democracy. They're so fierce about it that for me was a good takeaway, or the takeaway, really.
Absolutely. Well, I know I'm running out of time a little bit with you. I do want to go around though and ask, what do you want the audience to take away for the election upcoming in November? Do you have a message to the audience, either related to the film or in general? Stephen, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think well, the tagline for the film is democracy is not a spectator sport. I think it's very interesting what Amanda hit on is that if I remember correctly, only 82% of statesmen voted in the general election. And that's, you know,
Amazing.
again, as Amanda says, they don't have anything else to do. Voting is held like right before the talent show. So go, you know, you don't have to have an ID. You don't have to be registered. You don't have to have your, you know, correct mailing address. You don't have to be, you know, a U.S. citizen to vote in this Boy State election. You just go onto the computer, you put your ID number on your lanyard, and you pick a vote, and you're done. So I think, you know, it's said a lot about, you know, every single cycle that this election is the most important election, and it's, you know, it seems that the stakes are always raised every year, or every cycle, where I was really hoping to see record voter turnout among young people this year, hindered by the coronavirus pandemic. You know, I really think this year could have been historic, because I think this year, regardless of COVID, was really a year of mass youth involvement, and especially with Black Lives Matter and taking to the streets. So what I hope people's takeaway from this film is not only vote, because voting doesn't, you know, it seems to that it's too easy of a thing to say, go vote and everything will be better. It's not really that simple. I think it's a mixture of things. It's to make sure that you're civically engaged, and that means a number of things. It means to be informed, to be updated on what's happening in the world, to be able to form a cohesive opinion on something, and not just base your opinions on politics or a political viewpoint by what one media outlet says or what one meme might say. It's voting, it's volunteering in your communities. It's just taking time to make sure that you are an informed person and are aware of what's going on in the world around you, because politics does play such an important role in people's everyday lives. A big thing about young people is that, you know, they don't care about politics. And I think what I hope to do in the next, you know, 60 something days until the general election is to help show young people that we have stakes, and, you know, you know, we have a stake in this, and a pretty big one at that. But because what the next 4 years decides on what our positions are going to, you know, what government's position is going to be on immigration, on climate change, on women's reproductive rights, on healthcare, on college and education, on infrastructure, on foreign policy. You know, what is the world we're going to inherit in just a few years when we're eligible to start running for, you know, Congress or state representative, or, you know, city council, mayor, governor. It's important for us to be aware and to come out in droves and show that, you know, we are one of the biggest voting blocs, and we have the power to shape policy in this country, but we won't ever do that. And, you know, people in their 70s, you know, are going to continue making other decisions in Washington that are going to affect me and you for the next 20, 30, 40 years, unless we decide to throw ourselves into the process and get involved. And doing that, I believe, would make this country a way better place to be able to have that input from young people. And if you're too young to go vote, like I was in you know, Texas Boy State 2018, we can, you know, there's activism is what Renee's doing right now, and it's you know, there's so many ways to serve this country that I think all four subjects are trying to do in one way or another. Robert is right now at West Point, you know, in, you know, a few years will serve this country in the armed forces as an officer. Ben is hoping to pursue, a career in the State Department or national security. I myself am hoping to pursue, continue pursuing electoral politics and help with legislation and policy. And Renee is there, and I think one of the most integral of them all is activism, because the only time anything has ever been done in this country is through mass disruptions and mass amounts of people getting together and not requesting change be given to them, but demanding it. That's so important. And just those are four many different ways you can make this country a better, safer, and more equitable place for every single human being living here.
Jesse and Amanda, takeaways?
Well, I think Stephen said it so well. I think that when we started the project 3 years ago, motivated by this political division in our country, it seemed inconceivable that things could get worse, but of course they have. And we've seen the institutions that sustain our democracy under assault. I think we all recognize now that it's not something we can take for granted. And I think that this film, this experience, meeting people like Stephen, and being inspired by them, by their moral leadership, I think we can look around and see other young people leading political movements around gun violence and climate change. We know that young people have powerful voices for change. And I'm sure our audience, are politically engaged. But I think that, to me, is the powerful message of the film that I took away, is to see people, Ben too. I mean, Ben actually has had a really powerful reflection on the corrosive cost of his actions at Boise State now that he's 2 years older. And I think that kind of honest reckoning with himself is as inspiring as Stephen's own integrity and leadership at Boise State. So that makes me feel hopeful amidst the darkness. And so I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I second, third, fourth, and fifth, everything these two guys said. I mean, also just again, to speak to what I said earlier, there's the reminder for me that the kind of leadership that Stephen, we watch him do and engage with, is who he is. The kind of serve others, not yourself kind of leadership. I think people are hungry for it. It's why that group of kids who are very different from him responded to him. And that's not a right or left polarization. That is a need I think everybody has. And it was a reminder for me that's really, it's there. And
I think we all wanted a Hollywood ending to the story too. We wanted Stephen. We believed Stephen would win. It was really crushing for all of us. But also,
me too. I thought he would win. Also,
we shed some tears too. And but I think Stephen has been a resilient fighter all his life, and the struggle is a long struggle, as he alludes to. And these things are not given easily. And what he says that you become strong by defying defeat is our words to live by in the struggle for justice and equality and the political struggles that we face. So.
Well, thank you. I've tremendously enjoyed this, and I could talk about it all day, but I think I have to leave it with Claire, and thank you, Claire, again, for the chance to do this.
Of
Thanks,
course,
Lauren.
thank you all so much. And I just have to chime into that, yeah, we were really sad when Stephen didn't get it at the end. We were just like, what?
Me too.
Yeah, you too. It really, I mean, I didn't quite get to crying, but I just looked at my husband and we were just like, okay, here we go. And it's just kind of as disappointing as the political structure has been recently. So, but we so appreciate the work that all of you are doing. And Stephen, keep fighting the good fight. You are doing such a wonderful job, and you are truly inspiring. And thank you for continuing to create films like this. And we so appreciate you all being here. And thank you again for your time.
Claire.
Thank you, Claire, Lauren.